Untold Reddit stories. My dad died at 45. And then I uncovered the terrifying truth. When I was 15 years old, my dad suddenly passed away. He was only 45. They said he had a heart attack while working on his boss's, Mr. Oliveira house. He had worked there his whole life, taking after his father's duties when he died of heart problems. When we heard what happened to my father, my mother cried her eyes out. But my grandma, his mother, broke down crying, sobbing. Worse than my mother. I have never seen anyone cry like that. It was so desperate. I don't even have the words to describe it. But it was her son, the only child she had left. My mother fell into a massive depression. But my grandmother, she was never the same. She had a weird look in her eyes. Not only sadness, but also guilt. She never spoke about it, but you could feel that she felt responsible for what happened to my father. I tried talking to her about it one time, but as soon as mentioned that guilt in her eyes, she slapped me so hard I fell backwards. I was in shock. My grandma never even yelled at me, let alone hit me. She instantly broke down crying again, sobbing. Despite what happened, I hugged her, comforted her. I couldn't even imagine her pain. And how could I be so insensitive to even talk about this with her? Saying that she felt guilty of her son's death. I could never forgive myself. A few weeks after what happened, Mr. Oliveira visited us. Well, he visited me. My mother and grandma were out. He knew we were struggling to make ends meet, despite his help paying for the funeral. He offered me a job. It felt a little odd, offering a job to a 15-year-old that required to drop out of school. It felt even weirder when I remembered that the same happened to my father decades ago. I accepted, without speaking to anyone first. We barely had food. Our bills were piling up. We were on verge of getting evicted. When my mother and grandmother got home, I told them the news, with a smile on my face. I talked about how I could make them safe now, how I could make sure they wouldn't have to worry about food anymore. My mother, crying, didn't say anything besides she wished things could be different, that she wished I could be a normal kid, go to school, graduate. I thought she would be fuming, but she just thanked me, gave me a tight hug, and went to her bedroom. My grandmother, on the other hand, was bawling her eyes out, mumbling. She dropped to her knees, begging me to not do that. She begged and begged, said we could find another way. She said I couldn't do this. When I asked why, she got silent. I didn't push too much. She had a lot on her plate. After that, every time I saw her, she would just cry and cry and cry. She would cry, rocking her chair, while staring at me. But it felt like she wasn't even looking at me, just gazing at something else behind me. After I started working for Mr. Oliveira, she stopped crying. She stopped even talking. She just had this weird look in her face. It was like she feared something all the time. It felt like her eyes were empty, if that makes any sense. She passed away a couple of months later. Mr. Oliveira took care of all the funeral costs. My mother, my loved mother, Amber, fell ill a few years later. They said she had dementia. I tried caring for her the best I could, but it was so hard. The emotional, mental, and physical toll it took on me was too much. Mr. Oliveira was a lifesaver. He paid for the best care money could afford for her. He would even visit her every other day. He was a blessing in our lives. Unfortunately, a few years later, my mother passed away. I got a box of her stuff. Everything she owned fit in a box. How could a person's life fit in a box? Someone who had a life, had parents, siblings, friends, lovers, kids, decades of life in a box. I never even opened it, just put it away at my house and forgot about it. I had no one. I was alone. I was lost. When I went to Mr. Oliveira to hand him my resignation letter, he didn't even give me the chance to speak. He just hugged me, held me there, without saying a word. I broke down. I sobbed and cried. I told him I was alone. I had no family left, no friends, No one. He looked into my eyes and said I would always have him by my side, that I was family to him. That same night, I lit that letter on fire and never spoke to him about it. Not that much time later, I met Janet. Janet was Mr. Oliveira's niece. It was love at first sight for me. She was beautiful, smart, caring. She had long, soft, dark hair, beautiful brown eyes, a little shorter than me. She was everything I could ever want, and more. I thought I had no chance. She came from a ridiculously wealthy family. Why would she even bat an eye at someone like me? Her employee. But she did. She came to talk to me every day. She made the first move. She invited me to our first date. She kissed me first. And, despite my fears, she was the one who told Mr. Oliveira. And, when he called me to his office, I was ready to get fired on the spot. As soon as I opened his door, I started vomiting words like sorry and apologize and disappointment. Told him I was so sorry for disappointing him, for going behind his back like that, for not warning him first, after all he did for my family. He got up, got his Macallan bottle, 2 glasses, and 2 cigars. That night, he drank with me. We smoked a cigar together, on his office, while he talked about how happy he was that his niece chose me to be with her, how he felt relieved, how she couldn't have a better person on his side. Mr. Oliveira was like a father to me, and to have his blessing was just incredible. He paid for our wedding. He paid for our honeymoon in Europe. He was always there for us, for both of us. I never asked for his money or gifts. I tried to refuse every time, but he insisted on paying. It were his gifts to us, as he said. I was so grateful to this man. I was only 30 when we had our first one, John, and a few years later, at 35, we had Amanda. They were my pride and joy. I loved them like I have never loved someone. The way they would come running at me when I got back from work every day, screaming, "Daddy! Daddy!" The drawings they would leave for me, the gifts they made at school. I loved them both so much. When Amanda was 10, she went missing. Janet and I had called a nanny so we could go out for a date night. When we got home, the nanny was sleeping on the couch. John was in his bed, but Amanda, she was just gone. Mr. Oliveira went all out, paid the best investigators, made sure the police didn't drop the case, even after months of search, due to his impressive network with the higher-ups. But we never found her. My world fell apart. Janet couldn't even look at me anymore. She cried all the time, but whenever I tried to speak with her, she would shut me down. She even neglected John. Never had time for him, barely spoke to him. I tried to be there for her, for him, for both of them. But I couldn't talk to my wife. My son was so sad about what happened with his sister, how his mother was treating him, that he barely spoke. I had failed, as a father, as a husband. However, I held tight. I still had to at least put food on the table for them. I didn't know how to make everything normal, or at least as normal as possible. That's when I remembered that my grandmother had gone through this, losing a child far too early, and that she had some kind of journal. If I was lucky enough, it should be on my mom's stuff, since I knew that my mom cleaned up the house after my grandmother's passing. I went to the attic searching for it, and it was there. Lucky me. There she talked about the death of my grandfather. She talked about how sad was seeing my father giving up on his future to provide for them. She talked about how the family was never the same after Linda, her daughter, went missing. That happened just before my grandfather's passing. I never knew my father had a sister. No one ever told me that, not even my father. She wrote about how Mr. Oliveira took care of the funeral and how good he treated her son. However, she also wrote that, a couple of days before dying, my grandfather came home one day, looking like he saw a ghost. He told her that he found out who, or rather what, Mr. Oliveira was. He started talking to her about how Mr. Oliveira's family had been employing our family for generations. He found out while repairing his desks, a book, a very thick and old book. He mentioned to her that what was written there couldn't be real, how it went back much longer than him or his father, how for generations our family worked for the Oliveiras, or at least he chose to believe that there were multiple Mr. Oliveiras, because someone couldn't live that long, right? How? It all began when someone from our family, living in extreme poverty, found a job at that same manor. How that man lost his sister. How that man died at 45 of heart issues. How that man's son began working for Mr. Oliveira at 15 years old to provide for his family. How his father, my great-grandfather, got the same fate. He told my grandmother that how was it possible? How could have no one noticed that pattern before? How could he forget his own sister? She thought my grandfather lost it, that he was having some mental breakdown. Didn't believe it at all. Then he died of heart issues at 45. Then my father started working for Mr. Oliveira at 15 years old. How her daughter went missing. How she thought that it was all a coincidence. But slowly, my father forgot his sister. No matter how much she tried talking to him, he could never remember her. How one day my father took her to a doctor because he thought that she was developing dementia or something. And how even she started forgetting about her daughter. The only proof she had was the entry she wrote on that some journal. But what if that wasn't even real? What if she was trying to cope with her husband's death and somehow imagined another tragedy to focus on? Then she stopped writing for years. Found a way to cope or something else, but she didn't write anymore. That's until her granddaughter Brianna went missing. Her granddaughter? My sister. But I don't have a sister. I can't have a sister. I have no memories of her. Nothing. That's when I felt the dread. The dread of realizing what could have happened. The dread of realizing my grandmother's reaction to my father's sudden death. Her reaction to when I mentioned why she felt guilty about his death. The reaction she had when I started working for Mr. Oliveira. She felt guilty for not believing my grandfather. She felt guilty for letting this thing go on, whatever it is. My heart sank. It was true. It was all true. I am writing this, hoping that Janet can read this and not make the same mistake I did. Hoping that she can get John out of this. I turned 45 a while ago. I can feel my chest hurting. I don't know how much longer I have before I can finish writing this. I am not even going to waste my time trying to call for help. My fate is set. I don't know what Mr. Oliveira is. But please, John, don't ever work for him.